This is the Hinderer XM-18 custom hand ground Spanto 3.5-inch flipper model, the 4th generation. In case you wanted to see what one looked like completely disassembled. Everything is the same on their production XM-18s, like this one right here. The only thing that's going to be different that I see is the very sexy blade, and I noticed the pivot was polished, and other than that I see everything else is the same. Now I'm going to take all these parts right here and put them in the ultrasonic cleaner, get them cleaned up. So here's what the parts look like before. Pay attention to the crevices in there and in there and in there. Should clean up real well. See, this is before cleaning. It's not that dirty, but it's going to be a lot cleaner after it goes to the ultrasonic cleaner. Now the blade has already been in the ultrasonic cleaner, and this is as clean as the blade will ever be. See that very nice satin finish, perfect grind lines. That nice convex, or concave grind right there, and on the tip of the Spanto it looks like to be a convex grind on the tip there, either flat or convex, and then a concave cutting edge. You can see that this area right here on the outer portion of the blade is sandblasted. Provides a nice grip on the flipper. I'm thinking the whole blade was sandblasted to begin with, and then they brushed the flats, did the concave grind, and grinded the swedge right there, and you're left with a bead blasted inside the jimping there and on the outer edge of the blade, except for where they cut the lock face right there. Here's the other side of the blade. This is the side that does not have the detent ball. See that Spanto tip right there, sort of convex or flat, and then that nice concave grind. You can tell it was done by hand. It's nice. This blade is literally perfection. So there's a 3-tone finish there. You got brushed, satin right there, and then sandblasted. And you can actually see remnants of sandblasting in the pivot. You can see a little bit of sandblasting. I'm not sure why they didn't drill out the hole and polish it. I'm not sure why the inside of the pivot is sandblasted. If you get a closer look at it, you can obviously tell that it's still sandblasted, and the shiny spots you see in there are from wear from opening the knife. It's creating scratches in the sandblast finish. So I guess that's how they do their pivot. I was hoping to see the inside of the pivot polished, or at least a satin finish like Chris Reeve. But the knife is buttery smooth, so I guess that's how they make their knives. Can't complain if the knife locks up perfectly solid, but still buttery smooth. Here's a closer look at that jimping on the flipper. Very aggressive and sharp. That sandblasting and finger choil there adds some real good traction. But you could literally cut yourself on those sharp flipper jimping right there. Very sharp. But I do like that flipper jimping much more than the production flipper. Production flipper has very smooth jimping, and the entire flipper is pretty much smooth and the corners are rounded, whereas the corners on here are perfect 45-degree angle sharp corners, so it looks nice and clean. See the corners on the flipper all rounded off, very smooth. Alright, all these parts have been ultrasonic cleaned. Everything is brand new and shiny, just like it comes from the factory. Actually, I bet they're a little bit cleaner, because Hinderers usually come with some coolant on everything, on the blade, on the screws and parts. Here's what the lock side looks like. Notice the crevices are perfectly clean now. Not a speck of dust or dirt anywhere to be found. And this is all by the ultrasonic cleaner, so no scrubbing at all. So no need to take a toothbrush to scrub it and risk scratching your titanium or any other delicate parts, because titanium does scratch easily. Cleans out any Loctite that are in the threads. Brings out the stone-washed finish. You can see all the scratches much better. And these screws, perfectly clean and shiny now. And that pivot screw, there was a bunch of caked up purple Loctite on there, and it's now perfectly clean and shiny with no more Loctite on it, and that's just from sitting in the ultrasonic cleaner for 30 seconds. No more Loctite on the threads, along with the pivot. Cleaned out the Loctite that was inside the pivot. And I put the carbon fiber scale in there for about 10 seconds, and it looks kind of dull, so I'm gonna put some wax on it. See how much shinier inside of the holes are. The holes are actually polished. Brings out the polished surface. cleans the lock face, cleans out the threads for the screws. So there's a look at the carbon fiber handle scale before I put some Jet Seal 109 on it. Here's what my other carbon fiber scale looks like. The pattern looks slightly different, though both of them were bought from monkeyedge.com. I guess the carbon fiber pattern depends on how it was sanded down or how the carbon fiber was cut. You see, this is like a dog bone or oval shaped pattern, whereas this is a square carbon fiber weave pattern. This is after the first coat of sealer. A slight difference. This is how it compares to my other scale after the first. This is after the second coat of sealer. Starting to look much more shinier like this one with a deeper gloss to it. Alright, I'm gonna see if I can make the blade look any better by putting some Jet Seal 109 on the blade. So this is what the blade looks like before. Alright, there's the finished carbon fiber scale. I wasn't pleased with the results of just applying Jet Seal 109, so I put it in the ultrasonic cleaner and stripped the sealer off of it, and I went ahead and used some plastic polish. Used some of this Mother's plastic polish, and I put it on a microfiber cloth and rubbed it around for a while we were watching a movie last night. And that polished it up quite a bit, and then I put a few layers of Jet Seal 109 on it. As you can see, the finish is much darker and more glossier than the other carbon fiber scale right here, because this one was glossier and darker than this one in the beginning. Now this is much nicer. And here's the Jet Seal 109 that I use. It is not a wax, it's not a polish or Teflon, and you can see right here it works on carbon fiber and also works on fiberglass composites, and that would include G10 also, but it works on a lot of stuff: chrome, polished aluminum, glass, gel coated fiberglass, and even painted plastic. See it. It's an anti-corrosion. Works on fiberglass, aluminum, chrome, alloy metals. Developed for the aerospace industry. Ultimate in protection from the harshest environments. So it bonds to the surface of whatever you put it on, and it's virtually impenetrable. So that will look like that for a long time to come, and I'm waiting for the Jet Seal 109 to dry on the blade, which is about 20 minutes. Also, look how many parts there are on the Hinderer. I counted 26 separate parts available if completely taken apart, whereas the Ultimate in Simplicity, which would be a Sebenza or the Umnumzon, has only 13 available parts. And I've also got some kind of disorder or disease, maybe associated with OCD or something, and it's I always have to put things back together the exact same way I took it apart. And what I mean by that is this screw will always be right there, and that screw will always be the second, and that will always be the third, along with the standoffs and the pin right here. That pin will always go in that hole, and that one will always go in that one, and that standoff will always go on that pin, and that screw will always thread into that screw. It's just I take this inscriber pin and I make marks into which one goes where. So I mark that 1, 2, and 3. Now you cannot see the marks unless you look at it under a microscope. It's not something that you can just look at and see. It's not obvious at all. And another thing is the pivot. I always have to put the pivot back the exact same way, and that's always parallel this way. And then there's a mark on this side right here, so I know that this side of the pivot is always right here next to the lock bar, and that ensures even or wear on the exact same part of the pivot each time I disassemble and put it back together, because you get wear on the pivot whenever you open it and use it, and I want the wear to be on the same spot every time. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing, but I don't do it to everything. It's just some things, like my RC cars, I like to put the screws back in the same places each time, but that's also with all the knives, most of them anyways. Like the Zahn pivot is always put back together the same way each time. And always make sure the washers go on the same side each time, with the same side touching the blade, along with all of the other knives, whereas it's pretty easy on the Hinderer since the small one goes on first and then the large one, and you can see the wear marks on which side touches the blade. But on some knives it's harder to tell, so I have to mark them. Alright, the blade is done with the Jet Seal 109 treatment. Let's see if we see any difference in the shine or the finish. Not really anything off the bat, but I'll have to go back and compare the video. But it is protected, that's the good thing. It will protect it from any kind of corrosion, so it adds another layer of rust resistance, even though Duratec 20CV is already considered a stainless steel, but another layer of protection. Alright, now it's time to assemble the knife, and these are your best friends right here. Remington Dry Lube Finish Line Extreme Fluoro and CRK Grease. Very good stuff. Now if you want to prevent wear, you'll want to use this Finish Line, but if you want the smoothest knife possible while still preventing wear, you can use CRK Grease. And for other things, I'll be using the dry lube. Now since I'm very meticulous in the way I do things, I put lube on pretty much everything, everywhere. Prevents wear, scratches, friction. So getting some dry lube in the pin slots there. I use dry lube where a grease or oily lubricant would not be good, because it will attract dirt. You can use this on the lock face, because grease will attract dirt. You don't want dirt and grime on your lock face. And I'll put some dry lube on all my pins and standoffs. There's no specific reason why I do it, nor am I recommending that you do it. It's just what I do. Maybe I'm paranoid, or maybe I have OCD. Oops, that was a little too much. Maybe that will reduce friction when I put it in my pocket and when I take it out. Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't really matter. Now this stuff dries really quick and it doesn't leave a residue if you put it in the amount that they tell you to. If there's a white residue left over, then that means you put too much. But if you put just one thin coating on there, it dries up, there's no residue, and it's completely dry. Now to put your Hinderers together, you're also going to need some tape. What I like to do is blow off any dust that might be in here. And you can put your pins in. Now you'll need some tape to hold your pins in, unless they stand by themselves, which mine usually do not. I just take a little piece of tape, put it on each pin. That will hold them there like that. And then you can go ahead and put your pivot in there. Alright, there's a tiny mark on this side of the pivot, so that lets me know that my pivot will go in like that. Go ahead and tape it down. I have not used grease on anything yet. That's coming up next. Alright, go ahead and put the small washer on first. No grease yet. Now what you'll want to do is put some grease on the pivot and also on the washer. Try not to use an excess amount, and try not to get it on the frame here, just keep it on the washer only. And if you need to, use a non-abrasive pointy tool to meticulously coat the entire area, including the corners of the pivot and washer, because the tip is not sharp enough. It's much easier on this kind of tip. It's much sharper, smaller, it'll fit in the corners. After that, you'll want to put a small amount of grease very close to the pivot. That's where the washer is going to be. Don't put it outside of where the washer doesn't contact. And then you'll want to put some grease inside the pivot. Move it around. And then if you want to, you can put some grease where the tracks for the detent ball are. That'll help make it a lot smoother and prevent wear from that ball sliding on the metal. Maybe put a little bit inside the detent ball hole. And then I also put a little dab of grease on the lock face and the corner here. Put a very small dab of grease on the detent ball. And on this part right here, this is where the blade tang contacts the lock bar. After it slides off the detent ball, it makes contact with this part of the blade during opening and closing. So after a while, if there's no lubrication on here, this titanium will start to wear off right here. So it's good to put a little lubrication on there. Now that we've got the blade all lubed up, you can go ahead and put the blade on the knife. Doing so very carefully. Now on the Hinderer, it's easier to put it together in the open position and let the lock bar slide forward on the blade. Because if you do it in the half open position, like on a Umnumzan or a Sabenza, it will push the blade off the pivot because the tolerances are pretty loose compared to Chris Reeve. Now I'll go ahead and put the stop pin in there. The stop pin is only touching the blade in the closed position. It does not touch the blade at all in the open position. As you can see there, no contact with the blade whatsoever. Now I'm going to go ahead and put some grease where the washer is going to make contact with the blade. Careful not to get grease outside of where the washer contacts. And then I'll go ahead and put the washer on there. Now every Hinderer I've ever taken apart has metal shavings inside the Teflon washers. Those are there by accident, and what they do is they cause scratches in your blade, scratches and gouges. Now I like to look at the washer to see which side has less metal, and I'll put that side touching the blade. Go ahead and put that washer on there. As you can see, I didn't put any grease outside of where the washer makes contact. That will prevent dust and dirt from sticking in that area. Go ahead and put these standoffs back on. Now we can put the liner back in there. Should fit together like a glove. You may have to move it around to get it lined up perfectly. It doesn't go on there as easy as a Chris Reeve scale would. But then you can go ahead and put your scale back on. my 2mm Allen here. I'll start by putting these 3 screws in first, not tightening it down at all, just screwing them in there. Careful not to scratch the nice brushed finish of the screws. Then I will go ahead and put a drop of purple Loctite on the pivot screw. Here's the purple Loctite, number 222 MS. This is what Chris Reeve recommends for the pivot screw. This comes off very easily if you ever need to take it apart or clean it. And I like to put a small drop at the very end of the pivot screw since it's very long. I don't want to put it over here because the next time I take it apart it's going to be very tight to take off all the way to the end, so if I put it there, it keeps the screw from coming undone accidentally. Go ahead and put the pivot screw in there. Now I do not have a Hinderer tool to tighten or take it apart, so I have made my own tools, which include a coin and a penny that I took a Dremel to, and I cut out a notch in the penny there to accommodate the other side of the pivot, and then this I use to tighten that side. So go ahead and stick this penny in there. I put the tape on there to prevent scratching or marring the surface. Yeah, just make sure you tighten down your pivot in the half open position. Just don't tighten the knife when the lock is engaged, because that will cause too much force going that way, because while it's the pivot isn't tightened down, the pivot goes to about 50%, and then it's supposed to be at about 25%. So if you were to tighten it down while the lock is engaged at 50%, because the pivot is loose and the lock bar is farther over than it's supposed to be, you could cause pressure going that way, and whenever it's all said and done, you might have 50% lockup because it's causing too much force going that way. It's the same thing as pressing in your lock bar as hard as you can, as far over as you can. Alright, once I snug the pivot down to where I about want it, I want to check to make sure the blade is centered, and sometimes it might be off to the right a little bit, and what I will do is press the blade over and then tighten these 3 screws down, and then I will loosen the pivot and then tighten the pivot back up and check to see if the blade is centered again. But since this blade is perfectly centered already, I'll just go ahead and tighten those 3 screws down. But usually just tightening the pivot will recenter the blade, as you can see there. If I loosen the pivot, it's over to the right, and when I tighten it down, it goes towards the lock bar, and I can sort of fine tune it to where I want it using the pivot also. But you don't want it too loose. You'd rather have it tight as you can get it, but still having a smooth action. And there's also a lot of movement on the scales. If you want to make sure that the holes and screws are centered in the scale, see, if I push up on the scale, there's going to be a larger gap up top, and if I push down, there's a larger gap on bottom. You see the scale moves around quite a bit on there, so you can sort of move it around to get it centered to where you want it. And then I usually tighten from the pivot screw going this way, as to relieve the stress going outward. Not tightening it down too tight, just snug. Alright, so blade's perfectly centered, and then I'll check for blade play. Usually they have just a small amount of blade play, so I can tighten it down a little more because that's a little too loose, and there is a small amount of... Alright, I am done with this, and let me tell you that this is the smoothest Hinderer I have right now, and this is probably due to the Reeve grease. This is the first Hinderer I've used the Reeve grease for, and it is very smooth. And the detent on here has a very good detent, the best detent out of all my Hinderers, all 7 of them. You can see how buttery smooth that is. I do not have any other Hinderer that will do that except for the XM-24. That's because the blade is so huge and heavy, but it's not that smooth. This thing is real smooth. Barely have to press on that flipper to get it to go out. Lockup is at, I think when I got the knife it was at 15%. I think it actually is less than 15% now. And I have the pivot tighter than it originally was. And there is no movement at all on that blade. This is tighter than all of my Hinderers, yet it's still buttery smooth. Here's my EDC Hinderer. This has the Finish Line Extreme Fluoro Grease in it. See, even when I press the lock bar, it drops down, swings freely, but when I let go of the lock bar, it's not that smooth, and there is grease where the detent ball slides. Smooth, but not as smooth as the Reeve grease. So there we have it. All I have to do now is put the clip on and we'll be set. See, with the Extreme Fluoro Grease, I have to keep the pivot a little bit loose in order for it to be smooth like I want it to. See, they'll move just a slight tad, and then they're still not as smooth. This one is rock solid. Yeah, it's still buttery smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and, when I get the time, go take the rest of the Hinderers apart and use this grease. And for the pocket clip screws, you'll want to use a Phillips head number 1. If you use a Phillips 0 or a 00, it's going to be, it'll work, but you will the 0 or the number 1 fits the Phillips head a lot better than the Zero would. You see that the Phillips Zero is a little loose inside the screw, and then you'll have those marks on the side of the Phillips head that are sharp to the touch. So if you use the Phillips number 1, fits in there perfectly, snug, and you won't mar the edges of the screw. Most of the Hinderers I've gotten where they've changed the pocket clip, the edges are sharp because the screws got marred from using a smaller Phillips head. Alright, put the pocket clip back on and the filler tab. So everything's put back together just the way it's supposed to be. And you need to also be very careful when tightening down these screws right here, because I received this one with a broken off screw still inside the threads, and I was able to get the screw out, but it wasn't that easy. So it's easy to over tighten this and break off the head of the screw. You wouldn't want that to happen. So just tighten them down snug, and if they do end up loosening on you, which I have not had that problem yet, you can just use a very small drop of purple Loctite. That will take care of it. And the XM-24 on the left, custom 3.5 on the right. So there's a production Spanto on the left, custom on the right. I do think the production Spanto tip is a little thicker though, which I do like. But the shoulder on the custom is very thin at 0.5 millimeters, so the custom is going to be an excellent slicer, whereas the production has a very thick shoulder at 1 millimeter, and it's not going to cut cardboard very well or any harder materials like rope. So that'll be it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please comment and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.